It's Dr. T, and in this episode, we're answering the question, is gender rooted in biology? So in case you missed my earlier discussion about gender a couple episodes ago, I'm going to just quickly recap that sex and gender are two different things. So sex is the category that you're put into based on your genitalia when you're born. So male or female historically are the options that you've had. And then gender is all the expectations we have about how you should be, what you should do, based on that sex category. So how a boy or a girl should behave, how a man or a woman should behave, our ideas about masculinity versus femininity. All of that is gender. Sex is simply the physiology of one's body and the category you're put in based on that. But gender, the social expectations we have surrounding the sex category, the implication is if you're a male child, you're going to be a boy, grow up to be a man. If you're a female child, you're going to be a girl, grow up to be a woman. That's what we've expected historically. And gender, as the gender scholar Judith Lorber once said, is a fundamental organizing principle of social life. We use gender to understand how we should interact with each other at a very basic level. And in our culture, we have focused historically on gender difference, this idea that men and women are very, very different from each other. And when I taught this in my classes, I would have my students, I'd very quickly go to the board and say, okay, tell me the qualities that are associated with masculinity. Tell me the qualities that are associated with femininity. And we put a list on the board. And very quickly, we would get things like men are strong, they're aggressive, they're rational, they're providers. Women are weaker, they are nurturing, they are emotional, and a little submissive to the masculine presence in their lives. And it was very easy for them to do that. And even though they recognized that not very few people actually at this point in time conform to those lists, it's very easy to generate those lists and to see that they still have relevance. I used to call it a cultural residue. It's something like it's stuck to you and you can't quite get it off of you. So we are very wedded to this idea that men and women are very different from each other. And we tend to think that that's because of biological differences. But even if you look at the physiology of humans, if you look at how we're built, what we look like, and how our internal parts operate, we are far more similar than we are different. But yet we still like to see them as different. We have long had evidence that the way men and women behave is rooted in cultural expectations very, very strongly. And this goes back to Margaret Mead, who published a book in 1935, so going on, 90 years ago, going on 100 years ago now, where she studied 3 groups that lived in New Guinea within relative geographical proximity to each other. They were the Arapesh, the Mandangumors, and the Chombuli. And they were very interesting because they all had very different gender expectations. So still male and female bodies, but different ideas about how those male and female bodies should move through the world. So for the Arapesh, both men and women in that culture conform to what we would think of as Western notions of femininity. They were very nurturing, they were not aggressive, they were not warlike, they both tended to children and so forth. The Mandamgamors were the opposite in terms of gender expectations in our frame of reference. They were very competitive, very aggressive. They were not nurturing at all. They were very harsh with their children. Women participated in war just like men did. And then the third group, the Chambuli, were the reverse of gender expectations. The women were the leaders. They were much more aggressive. They engaged in warlike activity. The men stayed home. They took care of the children. They tended to the fires. They cooked. They would do each other's hair and gossip, all the things we associate with femininity historically in our culture. So this is really strong evidence that it's not the biology, it's not the hormones coursing through us that has the strongest impact on how we behave. Has some impact, obviously, but the strongest impact is the cultural expectation. for how a male or female person will behave. So thinking about studying gender here in the United States and in other Western industrialized countries, some of this early research, and by early I mean in the mid part of the 20th century, the mid 1900s, they used a lot of language about roles, borrowing it from the theater, this idea that men and women play roles. And these traditional roles were man as breadwinner and woman as homemaker and mother. Now, I always use the term traditional in quotation marks when I write it because there's nothing traditional about this. If you look at us historically, it was only a very short period of time in our history, right after World War II and up until maybe the 70s, where we had a slight majority of our country where women stayed at home and men were the sole breadwinners. Most people could not afford that. They needed all the labor and income they could get from family members. And certainly families of color, because of discrimination and lower wages that they faced, could not afford to live on one income. So this idea that this is the norm and has been historically is absolutely not true, but it's a cultural myth that we live with. And so this idea that men and women are playing out these roles was very attractive at that time frame. But scholars that came along and studied gender after that didn't like that idea. We don't use the term roles anymore, particularly because it suggests that people are kind of trapped into particular ways of behaving. And we all know people kind of move back and forth across those lines and those expectations. So it doesn't really describe the reality. The next big insight in trying to understand gender was an article that was published by Weston Zimmerman in 1987, where the article was called Doing Gender. And the idea was that gender is not something that's innate in you. It's not part of your biology. It's what they called an interactional accomplishment, meaning that as we move through the world and we talk to and do things with other people, we are demonstrating the gender category that we belong to. We do this with things like hair and clothing and makeup and how we groom ourselves. Do we shave parts of our body or not shave parts of our body? Our gestures, how we move, our voice, how we speak. I used to tell my students all the time that, these things can be changed. Like I could, for example, my voice is kind of throaty. This is just my normal voice, but I could make it lower. I could make it a little more grave in the way I speak. I could also make it higher. I can make it a little breathier. I can make everything I say end on an uptick, so it sounds like I don't know what I'm talking about. All these things that we can do to present ourselves in the world and give clues about how we identify and the extent to which we conform to masculine or feminine expectations. We also can do things differently. So we cannot conform to the expectations that are on us societally for our gender. We can do things very differently. We can step outside. In my case, I can step way outside the bounds of femininity and do things that are masculine. The catch is that I may pay a price for that. And this is what they called accountability. So that there is still this standard out there. And even though those lists I talked about earlier aren't as relevant as they used to be, they're not completely gone. And so women are still held accountable. For example, if they're too forceful in trying to get what they want, they are considered aggressive. And aggressive is a bad thing for a woman. She might cross the line from aggressive into bitchy, for example. So being referred to as too aggressive or bitchy is not a fun thing. So that's people sort of putting a price or a punishment on you for stepping outside the bounds of what's considered acceptable. Weston Zimmerman also talked about being able to fail at gender. And by that, they were talking about people that we would now think of as non-binary or perhaps transgender even. That you are not showing the world the proper category. You're not giving people the proper clues as to whether we should treat you as a man or a woman. And this is what it comes down to, because we do treat men and women differently, as I just said with my example about how I might behave in the workplace, aggressive, bitchy, etc., versus assertive. Or even a man, if he's aggressive, well, that's what men are supposed to be. Women are not supposed to be aggressive. So this idea that my presenting myself in this way that looks feminine is a choice. It's not something that just normally, naturally happens from the fact that I am a female biologically, physiologically. So we have a lot of options and we have latitude, but we may face some punishment for the choices we make. Right now, people who are non-binary, who are transgender, are facing a lot of punishment, a lot of pushback, and a lot of hostility from people who don't understand or don't accept this idea that there could be more than two genders, or there could be multiple ways to be a female person or to be a male person in this culture. This doing gender perspective also recognizes that we are constantly constructing, creating this sense of ourselves as a man or a woman or as someone who is non-binary, let's say. It's an ongoing process. How we groom ourselves, that takes ongoing effort. The clothing we choose to wear and to bring into our homes, that's an ongoing process. This perspective also recognizes that we can do gender differently in different contexts. So you might present yourself differently out on a date than you would in the workplace or out with friends. So that the fact that we can change how we present ourselves shows that, again, this gender is not something that's being called up from us from our hormones. It's something that we are actively engaging with and working with and repeating in some cases, or challenging in others, in a thoughtful, conscious way every day, every moment of every day. It also shows that some of the things that we hold to in terms of our dear beliefs are actually myths. So like maternal instinct, this idea that women, because they have this estrogen coursing through them, know what to do with babies, or they're the better caretakers. I used to tell my students, that's a load of crap. We socialize women to be nurturing. When their first toys is a doll, we have them babysit their younger siblings. We tell them they can earn money when they get to be 12 by going out and babysitting other children. I didn't have a lot of opportunities for that, for babysitting, those kinds of things. When my daughter was placed in my arms, I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. But I always told my students, fortunately, it's really easy to figure out parenting. If your baby is crying, there's only a handful of reasons. They're bored, they're hungry, they're wet, they're upset or in pain of some sort. And you just keep trying things until you figure it out, until they stop crying, because that's always the goal, is to get them to stop crying. But these are skills anybody can learn. Women are not specially equipped. Now, breastfeeding is another story, of course, but as I said, biology does come into play somehow. But women aren't innately more nurturing. It's just that we allow them and even encourage them to develop that where we don't with boys. So all the available evidence suggests that a lot of gender is really a put on. Or drag, even. Judith Lorber was famous for saying all gender is drag. We're taking these bodies that are substantially similar and dressing them up in ways that are appropriately masculine and feminine. The other clue that this is not rooted in biology is that what is considered masculine or feminine can change over time. So right now, pink is considered a girl's color and blue is a boy's color. At the turn of the previous century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, that was reversed. Pink was considered a man's color and blue is considered a woman's color. The other thing, being a secretary at that same time frame was considered an appropriate occupation for a man, not for a woman. Now it's reversed. So the fact that these things can change so dramatically, turn exactly 180, means it's not about hormones, it's not about physiology. It's about our cultural decision that the male and female bodies are so different that we have to separate them with these gender expectations and treat them fundamentally differently.